They were beautiful, brilliant, and seemingly immortal on screen. But tuberculosis didn't care about their fame, their talent, or their box office power. Before modern medicine arrived to save them, this invisible killer tore through Hollywood's finest, like a predator stalking its prey in a gilded cage. Here's the question nobody asks anymore. How many masterpieces were never made because TB stole the storytellers? Let's uncover the haunting stories of the Golden Age stars tuberculosis claimed. Number 1. Vivien Leigh. The woman who embodied Scarlett O'Hara was anything but fragile in front of the camera. Vivien Leigh commanded every scene like she owned it. Those piercing eyes cutting through dialogue with surgical precision and razor-sharp wit. She won 2 Academy Awards in her lifetime, worked alongside the greatest directors cinema had ever produced, and became the living symbol of old Hollywood glamour and elegance. Every movement was calculated. Every glance was devastating. Critics described watching her perform as a masterclass in control. But behind the red carpets and the accolades was someone locked in a brutal war with an enemy nobody could see. Tuberculosis had taken root in her lungs during the late 1940s, spreading insidiously while she continued to give performances that audiences found absolutely magical. Even as her body weakened from the inside, Leigh refused to surrender the roles that had become her identity. She pushed through fever and exhaustion, sometimes arriving on set looking startlingly hollow, her famous cheekbones now sharp in a way that alarmed her colleagues and concerned the crew. Friends noticed the persistent cough she desperately tried to hide during interviews and public appearances. Directors noted the moments when she'd grip the set for balance, when standing under hot lights for hours became genuinely unbearable. Yet she kept working. She kept showing up. She kept delivering. By the 1950s, the disease had progressed dangerously, spreading to her brain and fundamentally altering her mental landscape. The woman who could memorize pages of complex dialogue began struggling to remember lines. The fever that once kept her awake at night had become a constant, unwelcome companion. On July 8, 1967, at just 53 years old, Vivien Leigh died from tuberculosis and its complications. Hollywood mourned quietly, as if the entire industry was ashamed of not protecting one of its most precious assets from an infection that modern medicine had already made preventable. Her death became a footnote in history, overshadowed by her legendary performances. Number 2. Robert Louis Stevenson. Before there was CGI and elaborate stunts, Robert Louis Stevenson was out there filming swashbuckling adventures that made audiences grip the edges of their seats in genuine suspense. The man brought a roguish charm and natural athletic grace to every role he accepted, embodying the spirit of a golden era that valued romance, rebellion, and heroic action. Stevenson had that rare quality where you literally couldn't look away when he appeared on screen. His performances in films about pirates, cavaliers, and doomed heroes made him a consistent box office draw throughout the 1950s. Studios were fighting over him. Producers wanted him. Directors dreamed of working with him. Tuberculosis, however, didn't care about any of that. It was already circulating through his system, hiding silently in his lungs like an unwanted guest who'd overstayed his welcome. In 1955, when he was at the absolute peak of his career and his earning potential, the diagnosis came. Stevenson was devastated, not because he feared death, but because he was furious at the cosmic injustice of the timing. This was supposed to be his decade. These were supposed to be the years when every studio in town was competing fiercely for his talents. These were supposed to be his years of triumph. Instead, he found himself pulled into sanitariums and treatment facilities, away from the bright lights and the cameras that had become the lifeblood of his existence. He refused to let the disease define him. Against explicit medical advice, he continued accepting roles, though his energy flagged noticeably on set. His co-stars commented that something seemed off, that his usual vitality had been dampened. By 1957, it became painfully clear that the infection was winning the war. On April 13th, at only 43 years old, Robert Louis Stevenson died from tuberculosis. His last films are now bittersweet to watch, knowing that the undeniable vitality audiences adored was slowly being consumed from within, cell by cell, breath by breath. Number 3, Maria Montez. She was called the Queen of Technicolor, and for incredibly good reason. Maria Montez understood instinctively that in an era of glorious Technicolor cinematography, she needed to be absolutely unforgettable in every frame. Her costumes were elaborate and stunning. Her expressions were bold and commanding. Her presence was magnetic in ways that couldn't be faked or manufactured. She came from the Dominican Republic and became one of the few Latina stars that Hollywood's golden age actually bothered to celebrate on screen with serious leading roles. Montez appeared in adventure films where she wielded sword and wit with equal measures, refusing categorically to be just beautiful decoration in any frame. Men on set described her as a force of nature, someone who brought an electricity to the set that couldn't be manufactured in a lab or taught in acting school. Her energy was contagious. But between takes, increasingly often, some noticed her growing noticeably thinner. Her costumes, once fitting her perfectly, had to be adjusted repeatedly. The tireless energy that defined her performances became harder to sustain as weeks turned into months, though she never allowed that struggle to show in front of the cameras. Tuberculosis had invaded her body, draining her reserves from inside. Montez knew something was fundamentally wrong, but kept it private, perhaps believing that acknowledging illness meant surrendering completely to it. She continued working into the early 1950s, pushing herself to levels that horrified her doctors and terrified her family. The fever increased steadily. The cough became harder and harder to hide or disguise. By June 1951, her body simply gave out completely. Maria Montez died at just 39 years old, leaving behind a filmography that proved a woman of color could be a lead, could be captivating, could own every single scene she appeared in. Her death went largely unnoticed by major media outlets, a tragedy that reflected the era's casual and systematic erasure of Latina contributions to Hollywood's development. Number 4. Jean Harlow. Wait, this one requires honesty that many documentaries skip entirely. Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell, was believed by millions to have succumbed to tuberculosis in 1937. The public narrative was tuberculosis. The whispered explanation was tuberculosis. But modern historians have definitively challenged that account. Her actual death was attributed to kidney failure and uremia, not TB. Yet, she became permanently synonymous with the disease in public memory, a testament to how tuberculosis was so feared and so prevalent during that era that it became the automatic, reflexive explanation for any young star's sudden death. Harlow's actual illness is less dramatically romantic than the myth, but that's precisely why including her matters. It reveals something crucial about how tuberculosis shaped the narrative of Hollywood mortality during this period. Any time a beautiful young woman died unexpectedly, the whispers began immediately. Was it TB? Is she fighting that terrible disease? The disease became a dark shadow behind so many stories, whether it was accurate or not. Harlow's case shows how tuberculosis contaminated Hollywood's collective consciousness, how it became the boogeyman explanation, the disease that explained all tragedy and suffering. Number 5. Ramon Novarro. He was the great silent film star, whose dark eyes and perfectly sculpted features made audiences literally swoon in darkened theaters across America. Ramon Novarro appeared in nearly 100 films throughout his sprawling career, always working, always acting, building a reputation during Hollywood's earliest days when cinema was still figuring out what it could possibly become. His career spanned multiple decades, though, like many silent film actors, his star dimmed considerably when talking pictures arrived and exposed limitations audiences hadn't previously noticed. But Novarro never truly faded from Hollywood's institutional memory. Tuberculosis was something that happened to other people, he probably thought, during his earlier years. Surely his constitution was stronger. Surely his will and determination were more powerful than some invisible bacterium attacking his lungs. Yet by the late 1920s, the disease had taken hold with undeniable force. He continued working when he could physically manage it, accepting smaller roles in films where his weakened voice and diminished energy might go less noticed or criticized. The man who once held absolute sway over millions from the silver screen now found himself struggling against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't defeat with sheer determination or willpower. Novarro's treatments consisted of bed rest and what doctors of that era called fresh air therapy, essentially spending months in sanitariums where patients were basically warehoused. On October 30th, 1968, after years of fighting the disease with everything he had, Ramon Novarro died at 69. By then, he had become a footnote in cinema history, remembered more as a relic of the silent era than as the genuine star he once was. Yet his persistence through illness offers a quiet, powerful lesson about grace under immense pressure. Number 6. Hedy Lamarr. She was an absolute genius, and not just because she was stunningly, undeniably beautiful. Hedy Lamarr appeared in films that made her a household name. But what most audiences didn't know was that she held a patent for frequency hopping technology that would eventually be utilized in military communications and wireless technology. The woman was an inventor wrapped in a movie star's body, a mind that understood physics and engineering wrapped in a package Hollywood couldn't stop promoting. During the height of her fame in the 1940s, Lamarr was everywhere. Her face sold tickets. Her name drew crowds. Studio executives fought over her. But tuberculosis doesn't care about intelligence. It doesn't care about beauty. It doesn't care about patents or innovations. When the disease began attacking her lungs, it came as a genuine shock to someone who believed her mind could outthink any problem, overcome any obstacle. Lamarr was meticulous about her career and her public image. She didn't want anyone knowing she was sick. She certainly didn't want studios getting wind of it, knowing that any sign of weakness would immediately mean the end of her bankability and career prospects. So she hid it. She continued working, pushing through fevers and exhaustion, giving performances that audiences found absolutely magical, without knowing they were watching someone literally fighting for every breath. By the 1950s, the disease had progressed significantly. Lamarr's roles became smaller and less frequent, though she remained devoted to her craft with unwavering commitment. She lived until 2000, surviving tuberculosis by decades. But the disease had robbed her of years she could have spent inventing, creating, and pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible. Her survival was a victory, but one shadowed by lost time and stolen energy and potential. Number 7. Karen Morley. Karen Morley was a serious actress during Hollywood's golden age, someone who could convey complex emotions with just a single glance or subtle gesture. She didn't have the glamour quotient of some of her more celebrated contemporaries, but she had something arguably more valuable: absolute credibility. Audiences believed her completely, whether she was playing a struggling mother or a woman of questionable morals. Morley brought authentic humanity to every role. She worked consistently throughout the 1930s and 1940s, appearing in films that showcased her considerable range and her genuine talent for character development. Tuberculosis found her in the early 1950s, and for someone of Morley's generation, a TB diagnosis was like a death sentence whispered in a sterile hospital room by an apologetic doctor. The disease meant forced isolation. It meant being pulled away from the life you were actively building. It meant uncertainty and fear about the future. Morley faced the diagnosis with a stoicism that reflected her generation's approach to illness and suffering. You endured it quietly. You didn't complain or ask for sympathy. You hoped medical science would catch up fast enough to save you. She spent months in treatment, away from the studio system that had defined her professional life and identity. When she finally recovered, the industry had moved on without her. Younger actresses had filled her roles. Directors had found new muses to work with. Morley had survived tuberculosis, but watched her career essentially die in her prolonged absence. She lived until 1994, long enough to see the disease become a historical oddity rather than a death sentence. But she never regained the prominence she'd known before tuberculosis intervened. Number 8. Ivor Novello. He was a composer, an actor, a playwright, and a genuine theatrical genius of the highest order. Ivor Novello created operettas and films that captivated audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. He was Welsh, strikingly handsome, and carried an artistic sensibility that made him stand out even among Hollywood's most talented elite. Novello's works were celebrations of romance and emotion, lavish productions that showcased the absolute best of what theatrical cinema could be. Every production was a spectacle. Every performance was a statement. Critics marveled at his ability to blend music and drama seamlessly. But tuberculosis doesn't discriminate between genius and mediocrity. It doesn't care about talent or vision or potential. It simply attacks and destroys. Novello's diagnosis came in the late 1940s, a devastating shock to someone whose body had never failed him before. The disease meant the end of the physically demanding work that had defined his entire career. No more staging elaborate musical numbers for live audiences. No more commanding a film set with the precision of a conductor controlling an orchestra. No more controlling the energy and emotion of every frame. Instead, there was treatment and isolation and the frightening knowledge that even the best doctors couldn't guarantee a cure. Novello died on March 6, 1951, at 58 years old. His death removed from cinema a voice that understood the marriage between music and storytelling in ways few others did. The operettas and musicals he created influenced generations of theatrical filmmakers, even though many didn't realize it was his vision guiding their aesthetic choices and creative decisions. Number 9. Constance Bennett. Before Bette Davis, before Joan Crawford, before any of them, there was Constance Bennett. She was the highest-paid actress in all of Hollywood during the late 1920s and early 1930s. She commanded salaries that made producers wince and studio heads recalculate their entire budgets. Bennett had wit, intelligence, and a presence that suggested she was smarter than every man in the room combined. She appeared in sophisticated comedies and complex dramas, always the equal or superior of her male co-stars, never willing to be diminished. Bennett was someone who understood her worth in an industry that constantly tried to devalue women and their contributions. When tuberculosis entered her life in the 1930s, it was both a personal devastation and a professional catastrophe of the highest order. The disease forced her to step back from her career at a moment when she should have been consolidating her power and influence. Treatment meant months away from the studio system. It meant losing roles to actresses who were available and healthy and desperately hungry. Bennett eventually recovered, which was almost worse than death in some ways. She lived to see her career decline from its former prominence. She lived to watch younger actresses inherit the throne she once ruled absolutely. She lived until 1965, but her years as Hollywood royalty had been stolen by disease and isolation, and the industry's cruel indifference to anything that interrupted its relentless profitability. Number 10. Dane Clark. Dane Clark was a character actor who appeared in dozens of films throughout his long career. Always solid, always reliable. Never quite the leading man, but essential in ways audiences didn't always consciously recognize. He played cops and soldiers and working-class men with an authenticity that came from understanding life beyond the studio lot. Clark was prolific, taking whatever work came his way, building a respectable career through determination and genuine talent. Tuberculosis struck Clark during the absolute height of his working years, forcing him into sanitariums and away from the sets he'd become accustomed to occupying regularly. The disease didn't care that he had bills to pay. It didn't care that stepping away from consistent work could tank a career in this brutal industry. It simply attacked and forced him into a position where recovery became the only priority. Clark survived, which was genuinely remarkable for that era. But his career had suffered the kind of damage that doesn't heal cleanly or completely. By the time he was well enough to return to work, the roles that once came easily had dried up. Other actors had filled his niche. Producers had moved on. He continued working in television and film until his death in 1974, but his entire trajectory had been fundamentally altered by illness at a crucial moment in his career. His story represents the thousands of character actors and supporting players whose careers were derailed by tuberculosis, people who never made headlines, but whose absence was deeply felt in the films they should have made. Number 11. Lupe Velez. Lupe Velez was absolutely electric on screen, a force of nature with dark eyes that flashed with intensity and passion. She was a Mexican actress who refused to be boxed into stereotypical roles, commanding her space in films where she was often the most interesting and compelling presence. Velez brought a fiery energy to her performances that audiences found absolutely mesmerizing. She sang, she danced, she acted, all with equal skill and commitment. During the 1930s and 1940s, Velez was a major star, someone whose name could sell tickets just as effectively as any male star of the era. She was unapologetically herself, refusing to fade into the background or accept bit parts when she believed she deserved more. But tuberculosis doesn't care about attitude or determination or star power. It simply invades and begins its slow destruction. Velez was diagnosed with TB in the late 1930s, a revelation that shocked her deeply. She was young, vibrant, and seemingly unstoppable. How could this happen to her? She underwent treatment, hoping to return to work quickly. But the disease had taken hold more thoroughly than anyone realized. The recovery was slow and painful. By the 1940s, when she might have experienced a career resurgence, Velez was still dealing with the lingering effects of tuberculosis. Her energy was diminished. Her voice wasn't as strong. Directors noticed the change. Producers became hesitant about casting her in demanding roles. Velez lived until 1944, but her final years were shadowed by illness. She died at just 36 years old, far too young, far too talented, gone before she had a chance to show the full extent of her capabilities. Number 12. Lionel Barrymore. Lionel Barrymore came from one of America's greatest theatrical families, a lineage that expected excellence and delivered nothing less than perfection. He was a trained actor of the highest order, someone who brought a gravitas and depth to his roles that younger actors could only aspire to achieve. Barrymore's career spanned decades, from the early days of silent film through the golden age of Hollywood and beyond. He worked with the greatest directors, appeared alongside the finest actors, and built a body of work that defined what serious acting could achieve. But tuberculosis doesn't respect pedigree or training or experience. It attacks indiscriminately. Barrymore was diagnosed with TB in his middle years, a devastating blow to someone whose career depended on physical stamina and vocal presence. The disease meant reducing his workload. It meant taking roles that were less demanding physically. It meant watching younger actors take on the challenging parts he would have been perfect for. Barrymore eventually recovered from tuberculosis, but the damage to his health was permanent. He developed arthritis that confined him to a wheelchair in his later years. He continued working, refusing to disappear from the industry that had made him famous, but his options were severely limited. He lived until 1954, long enough to see his children and grandchildren pursue their own careers in entertainment. Yet he was haunted by what tuberculosis had stolen from him: years of prime work, roles he never got to play, collaborations that never happened. His story is one of resilience, yes, but also of loss and the arbitrary cruelty of disease. These are the faces you might still recognize from scratchy old films you stumble upon, the voices you hear in classic cinema, the talent that built Hollywood's entire golden age from the ground up. But tuberculosis didn't care about their fame. It didn't care about their genius or their beauty or their contributions. It took them anyway. It took years from them. It took potential from all of us collectively. Here's the real question for you. How many more masterpieces could these artists have created if illness hadn't intervened so cruelly? How many stories remain untold because tuberculosis stole the storytellers before they were finished? Tell us in the comments which Golden Age star's death impacted you most emotionally. Which one do you wish had lived longer? And whether you think Hollywood adequately honors the legacy of those lost to disease. Because remembering them isn't just nostalgia, it's rebellion against forgetting.